April Fools, nerds. I'm Alex.
And I'm Danny.
And we're seriously nerdy about a lot of stuff.
But mostly, more than any other thing we're nerdy about, Star Wars!
You have Star Wars tattoos.
I do
don't
have
any
Star Wars
tattoos.
permanently tattooed.
I should get a tattoo of a Star Wars.
So since we've last seen you, a couple things have changed. Number one, we're married now.
We're married now.
Number two, we're in a new apartment, but I repainted the gallery wall. So it's a little different, but the spirit is there. And number three, we made something really cool and we can't wait to show you.
We decided to take something that we picked up at Star Wars Land.
Nope, say it right.
Baby Yoda. Batu.
Use the full title.
Disneyland presents Galaxy's Edge. The Batu. The Squeakquel.
We picked it up at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, the Disneyland resort. They recently released the camtono from the Mandalorian. Quick nerdy backstory. When did we first see the camtono?
It was in Empire Strikes Back in the arms of Wilrow Hood at Cloud City.
These are true facts, but in the movie it was just an ice cream maker that looked sort of futuristic. But now it's canonized.
With a licensed camtono from Black Spire Outpost.
Yes.
Which we purchased one of, and then we did terrible things to it.
We would like to apologize in advance if you thought that this was just going to be us keeping this camtono pristine. One of the things we're very serious about on Seriously Nerdy is making stuff that serves a function and isn't just like pretty and is going to take up room on a shelf somewhere. And for whatever reason, our stupid monkey brain said, we could make that into a lamp.
So we've created what we could call a lamptono?
Basically, we're going to put a tiny diorama inside the camtono and then wire it so it can also be a lamp. A friendly reminder before we get started, this video is in no way affiliated with or endorsed by the Walt Disney Company. We're just fans making Star Wars stuff because we love it. Pew pew! Pew!
This is the camtono safe that we picked up from Disneyland's Galaxy's Edge. Ideal for housing all of your credits, medals, and other valuables. As you can see, it has a locking mechanism on the top so you can safeguard all your precious cargo, and a roomy interior that can hold at least a stack or two of pure beskar ingots. We'll only be trying to fit a diorama inside of it, but even that might be a little bit of a squeeze. We also got a lampshade from IKEA and a lamp kit online to better illuminate the way. For our key players, we bought a pair of Kenner Retro Mandalorian action figures online and only gently played with them before diving into the project. Fun fact, this tiny Mandalorian forge hammer has more political clout than the entire New Republic.
We had no idea what the camtono would look like on the inside, so the first thing to do was to take out the screws and take a look at the unit from the bottom up. It was pretty straightforward with a battery pack that was wired all the way up to the top where the safe mechanism was controlled. Each layer was held together by screws, which made taking it apart pretty easy, but also meant that when it was time to build the diorama, it was in layers, which would give us very easy access. And if you were ever wondering what the inside of a camtono looks like, now you know. We knew we wouldn't be using any of the safe components from the camtono, but thankfully the unit already had channels for those smaller wires that I could use for the lamp kit larger wires. That meant that I would have to expand the channels a bit with the Dremel, but it was easy enough to install. Now, I'm certainly no electrician, nor an expert in this field, but this was a very straightforward process to use the ready-made lamp kit. So if you're interested in making your own lamps, I highly recommend checking it out.
While these retro action figures were impressively posable, since we were planning to repaint them anyway, we supplemented with some green stuff to reinforce joints and smooth out some gaps.
Camtonos come with these sort of soft padded walls, but they peeled away easy enough and gave me a smooth surface for the two back walls of the diorama. So in order for this to become the Navarro forge, I would have to give myself a floor and some walls and then texture it up so that it really came to life.
Using our airbrush, we base coated the action figures in black, then applied white zenithal highlights. My first pass with the white spattered, so I spent some time in the airbrush penalty box. Our friend recently gifted us this airbrush hood, which has a vent fan that pulls all the fumes out while you're airbrushing. Thanks, friend.
It turns out that painting action figures is similar to painting tabletop miniatures, but the scale is a little bigger, which sort of translates to more friendly. Similar to how I would approach painting a tabletop miniature, I based out colors first in very broad strokes base coats, and then came back with shades and highlights later. I really loved having the art of the Mandalorian book right on the table as reference, so I was working from original concept sketches for the characters, which gave me great insight into how colors and textures were applied to these characters. The armorer action figure is pretty close to how she appears in the scene from Chapter 3, The Sin, but the Mando action figure we purchased is actually his post-beskar outfit, so I made sure to sort of scuff up the action figure, add some nicks and some dents, and then throw a lot more rust and mud application so that it looks like he's come straight from a fight with a mudhorn. Of course, the one sad thing about knowing that these would be glued into a diorama is that some of these details, for example, their backs, will never be seen because of how the diorama is situated. But true to form, I wanted to make sure that they would have looked beautiful from any angle and painted them out fully detailed on all sides. You might notice that Mando and the armorer are missing their accessories, so I'd actually cut off the plastic cape and the plastic fur shawl on both characters, and we'll add those later in actual fabric just to give them a little more texture. The interior of the Navarro forge is this beautiful domed environment, and so Alex and I went on a quest to find some sort of a dome sphere, and we found it at IKEA at this bowl for $1.49. The forge is such an important part of Mandalorian culture as we understand it thus far, so I worked from concept art photos in the Art of the Mandalorian book to bring this particular forge from this concept art to life. It may not be exactly true to the one we see on screen, but because it's sort of in shadow and placed different based on the framing of the shots, having a reference photo to work from that became my go-to reference photo was super helpful. So I started by creating foil shapes and wrapping around with a really rough pass in clay. This was not the final pass, but by pre-baking them and then applying more clay over it, it allowed me to get a little more of a firm work surface to play with. My forge is definitely a honed stone, and I noticed from the concept art that there's these beautiful details around the base, and I didn't want to carve each and every one out by hand because that seemed like that would take an eternity. So I turned to one of my favorite mediums, which is speedball rubber stamp carving. It's a super fun craft if you haven't tried it before. I've never used it in clay like this, but by creating one stamp, I could run around the entire edge of the forge with the exact same shape, and the clay was pliable enough to take the rubber stamp. Now, we love upcycling here at Seriously Nerdy, and I thought I would use this lid from an airborne container because it would make the perfect top of a forge where the 12 spires are poking out. I did not know that Airborne had these maybe water-absorbent crystals in the top. That was a fun surprise. For the top of the forge, I knew I wanted to upcycle some things that we have in our bits box. So these are lots of different plastic containers and our tried and true coffee stirrers, just to give that texture and technique, but also, give items that would have ended up in the trash new life by being a Mandalorian forge. With the forge base baked and hardened, I could go back to my bits box and glue on a few more details just to give it some flair. Also helpful to have things that are perfect circles up against that very organic clay shape. For this particular build, we did not choose to wire the lamp and the interior diorama lights together because we're not experienced in that, but nevertheless, it worked out just fine with a string of fairy lights that we could pop in and out of various places on the interior diorama. There are two little consoles on either side of the forge that we see in the scene. They don't get much attention, so I just used found objects to sort of create little consoles on each side that look kind of Star Wars-y. The console on the right will sit over the hinge of the camtono, and the console on the left will use the hinge of the camtono as sort of its base. Then I turned my attention to something we do see in beautiful detail, which is the table and two chairs that Mando and the armorer are sitting on. And I loved the base of this table because it looked like this sort of chunky rectangle of wood. So I had a lot of fun creating some wood texture to try to get it as close as possible to the original.
We integrated the vent hood for the Mandalorian forge into the plastic dome for the sake of simplicity and in order to save space in the actual diorama. The fairy lights will eventually run through it to provide some overhead illumination.
I had no idea that I missed my calling as someone who makes tiny furniture for action figures, but clearly this is my new passion in life. So I'll be putting in my 2 weeks notice at work and making clay furniture for action figures full time. I will be very poor. I wrapped clay around the wood console that I had built for the left-hand side console and thought I would kind of give it a gonk droid vibe. If you're not familiar with what a gonk droid is, please look them up because they are a charming little droid. But just wrapped it in clay and gave it some details to make it look Star Wars-y. That's a technical term. If they make a Wilrow Hood action figure that comes with a camtono, I could not find it online. But gosh, I hope they will, or they do. In the meantime, I was stuck making a subpar clay camtono that was to scale for these characters. It probably wasn't the wisest bet to do it out of clay just because it's such a precise shape, but it's close enough. It's a little chubby stubby, but it's fine. In case you were wondering what the client would pay me, instead of beskar, it would just be a camtono full of Diet Coke. I'm pretty sure Alex and I watched Chapter 3, The Sin, or at least this scene with the armorer, probably 50 times during this build, and I could see in the background that there are these very interesting curved lights that sort of wrap up the sidewalls. I figured I would use scraps from the bowl just because they already had a curve and I had them on hand. And in a tried and true fashion, I would glue some stuff on it to make them look like Star Wars. Now, in working with this really shiny plastic, one thing I know is helpful is to just sort of score it up or sand it, just so everything sticks a little bit better. So I did that for the lamps and also for the interior of the IKEA bowl. Both the bowl and the inside of the camtono got a coat of this Vallejo pumice texture just to give it sort of that gritty interior stucco look. The goal here was just to get as many components in place before airbrushing so that everything could go through that second interior and furniture airbrush coat at the same time. And that included making a tabletop for that beautiful rectangle hunk of wood. In the scene, you can see that I believe it's maybe wood wrapped in fabric. For our purposes for scale, I just crumpled up some tissue paper over a piece of wood and set that in place.
We had originally discussed filling the camtono with a diorama of the Empire Strikes Back scene of Han being frozen in carbonite, but it turns out finding licensed scale miniatures of all of those characters in the right poses is really challenging. So instead we picked this iconic scene of the Mandalorian presenting the camtono full of beskar to the armorer from episode 3 of season 1 of Mando. It's the first time we see the camtono in Mandalorian, and it's also a wonderful throwback to the original trilogy.
Just as I was getting ready to airbrush, I realized I hadn't given any of the sort of vent fins to the upper hood, but that was boring to watch, so I made them all for you.
It turns out there are few things in crafting as satisfying as witnessing the transformative powers of a good base coat with zenithal highlights. We do love taking a bunch of randomly colored objects and making them a handsome, uniform black before getting to the real painting. Another fun fact, this build features some greeblies that we picked up from a craft store in Tokyo. They had a 6-floor craft store, y'all. 6 floors. Just for crafts.
And with everything base coated, it was time to paint all the furniture and accessories. The forge was a lot of fun to paint because it's this massive stone structure, so it takes a lot of grays and blacks and shadows and lights and all sorts of fun paint techniques to bring it to life. But once I was finished, I remembered that there's this wire wrap that goes around the edge for the armorer to hang her tools from, so I quickly retconned that and drilled holes for some wire to run around the edge. The nice thing about using a found container for the top of this forge vent is that I was able to screw off the top and do any of the painting for that component, and then when it was time to install, I could truly just twist it back onto its base, and it was in place. See? Upcycling has more perks than one.
While Danny's painting everything, I'm just going to take this opportunity to tell everybody to go out and watch Andor. I love The Mandalorian, and I'm sure you do too if you're watching this video, but Andor is just incredible. I mean, I could probably talk for most of this video about all of the things I like about Andor, so you should check it out because we would all hate for it to get canceled before it gets a second or third season.
I noticed in the scene and in the concept art that the armorer keeps a ton of these tongs around the edge of the forge, but unfortunately the action figure only came with one pair of tongs. So I broke out some coffee stirrers and some bent wire, and when painted all silver, they look passable as sort of long-lost cousins of the ones that are accurate and came with the action figure.
Now that all the major objects are painted, it's time to dig into the electronics. We moved the switch for the fairy lights to the base of the camtono so it would be accessible from the outside, and soldered those ends together. Then we batched some fairy lights together to create the overhead light from the vent hood. Since the fairy lights are a single strand, it would be an interesting challenge to run them the entire length of the camtono and provide all the various light sources that we wanted to create. We ran the fairy lights wire along the inside edge of the camtono, stopping briefly for one of the suspended lamps on the left, and then moving on to the forge itself. After carefully pulling a batch of fairy lights through the base of the forge, we poked each into the, burner? What's the heating element on a forge called? I'm gonna go with burner. The whole thing ended up looking like a tiny arc reactor, so I guess, like Tony Stark, maybe a Mandalorian forge has a heart? I don't know. Judge for yourself. We then applied a little bit of hot glue over the tips of each of the LED lights to make them look like flames.
Now, once all of the wiring was in place, I had to go back and patch all the places that I had shamefully just gunked up wire with hot glue. That is where the magic of Vallejo pumice comes back in, because it blends pretty nicely into its previously placed surfaces. And I just had to sort of color match and blend out. You'd never even know there were tons of fairy lights wired all over this forge. Or maybe you would. Maybe you definitely would. With all the lights in place, it was time to figure out how to manipulate the bottom of this camtono unit so that I could still use the on and off switch and contain the battery pack. And somehow, by some miracle, it all worked. Because it all worked, I could then turn my attention back to the interior and start propping out the space, including adding these little tongs.
We did want to keep at least one of the foam sheets on one of the camtono door interiors, but it didn't seem like it fit with the grunginess of the forge, so we went ahead and distressed that and weathered it so that it had a dirty, grimy, Mandalorian covert look to it.
Okay, lamp time. So I had the main lamp cord wired all the way up through the lamp throughout the build, so I knew we didn't have too far to go. Then it was just a matter of screwing on these components and following the instructions to build the components that actually hold the light bulb. And from there, it's just the cord that runs down to the wall. And it worked. It really worked. So here I was, final steps, gluing everything in place, and I definitely didn't forget that I needed to make a cloak and a cape from Mandalorian and armor. That would be crazy. Just kidding, I did. So I quickly painted up a piece of fleece to look like fur for the armor, and for Mando, I used a piece of black, very thin fabric that I distressed, all mudhorn-like, so that Mando would have his iconic cape as well. It went really well. We needed to figure out a way to use the camtono door as a working door, so I installed what used to be a stand for a soldering iron into a little handle here, and then we installed a couple magnets on the door itself that would adhere to the top of the camtono, and that would give us a little resistance to open and close the door. And now for the really fun, glamorous part. Can we put the camtono back together the way it came? And the answer is pretty close. There were a couple components that we couldn't access just because it had a diorama in the middle now. But for the most part, all of the screws still aligned, and with a little glue in places that needed help, the camtono was back up and running.
We decided to do one final pass, weathering the exterior to get everything to the right level of grunge, and then we went ahead and installed the bulb and the lampshade. This is the way. We did it!
We questioned it too.
But we done did it.
It's done now. So what did we learn?
Alex still needs to get better at airbrush. I'm just gonna airbrush every day. Not every day. Every week. Once a week. Every few weeks. What did you learn, Danny?
I think that this was a project that definitely helped me get more comfortable with electronics and wiring. This is certainly not the video to come to learn more about how to correctly wire a lamp or rewire fairy lights. I'm definitely at the most novice stage, but I am excited that it's something I'm a little bit more comfortable with now.
We did not electrocute ourselves.
Or others. I think this was a great practice in sort of absorbing a space and how it feels and then translating it into a smaller space. Obviously, I wasn't going to be able to fit the whole forge area into a tiny camtono, but I liked interpreting what was there into a space that was a little bit smaller. It's not something that we actually do very often. We did it with Hocus Pocus.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're creating original environments.
Alex learned how to do a split screen in Premiere.
If you're not familiar with what that is, it's this.
I'm not going to do another split screen.
You're doing it right now.
It's so much
The
work.
screen is split right now.
Why would I make that choice? We don't have two clips that need to be put simultaneously.
Okay, back to normal. All right, you've heard enough from us. Let's get to that final footage. Here is the lamp tono. Previously on Seriously Nerdy.
I'm Alex.
And I'm Danny.
And we're seriously nerdy about Star Wars! Just Star Wars! Alright, we're gonna start again. This is the way.
We told you we're seriously nerdy about a lot of things, but there's nothing we're more seriously nerdy about than friggin' Star Wars. You know what Mandalorians do to April Fool's prank each other? They go,
Oh God. That was traumatic.
Mandalampian?
Lampalorian?
Mandalorian.
Lamptonadorian.
Ooh. What about just Chuck? If anybody has any contacts with Pedro Pascal, we are willing to give him the lamp tono, but it has to be Pedro in person.
Listen, Danny and I made the very difficult decision. If the internet's #1 daddy, Pedro Pascal, was to personally contact us and say, yes, we want the lamp tono, then he can absolutely have it. Because who wouldn't want an action figure version of yourself inside a tiny diorama, inside a piece of merchandise based on an ice cream maker from a 70s film that has been converted into a lamp?
It's so many layers.
It's Mandalorianception.
Oh.